Thanks to the Great Courses Plus for supporting this episode. Go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/religionforbreakfast to check out their huge library of lectures and courses taught by top-notch scholars in their fields. Kabbalah, sometimes anglicized as Kabbalah, is often defined as Jewish mysticism, but it's one of those concepts that's not only difficult to define, but constantly exoticized and stereotyped. For example, the pop star Madonna embedded Kabbalistic imagery into her 2002 music video for the James Bond film Die Another Day, which we'll examine later in this video. Generally speaking, though, mysticism refers to an experiential, spiritual endeavor to encounter or invoke the divine in this world. So this would include religious experiences of the divine, like ecstatic visions, rituals to try to access divine presence or to trigger transformative inner experiences. Mysticism can also refer to works of literature related to these themes, and though many Kabbalists could be described as ecstatic visionaries, the earliest Kabbalists were Jewish teachers, theologians, and philosophers. Most were the educated elite of medieval Europe, living in Spain and France, writing new and innovative studies on Jewish texts and concepts about mystical contemplation of the divine realms, the nature of God, the purpose of humanity, and the creation of the universe. The Hebrew word Kabbalah derives from the verb to receive, and could be translated as that which has been received, or simply tradition. The scholar Joseph Dan writes that Kabbalah is thus a claim by Jewish spiritualists from the Middle Ages to this day that they received a tradition that was held secret for many centuries. Secret or hidden wisdom that they believed was originally passed down to Moses at Mount Sinai and transmitted through the centuries to medieval Kabbalists. Kabbalah should not be described as a distinct branch of Judaism, in the same way that we talk about conservative Judaism or Orthodox Judaism or Reconstructionist Judaism, nor should it be defined as a unified or coherent system, but rather traditions encompassing several modes of reading, a library of texts, a series of concepts, and a range of practices within Judaism that is concerned with mystical contemplation. There's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. First, the origins of Kabbalah. Kabbalah emerged in southern Europe in the 12th century in several major centers of learning, including Provence in southern France, and areas on the Iberian Peninsula, including Girona and the region of Castile. But Jewish mysticism has a long history that stretches back hundreds of years before this. You can find mystical texts in the Hebrew Bible itself, such as the Book of Ezekiel, or the vision of the prophet Isaiah, when he beholds the throne room of God, surrounded by divine beings called seraphim crying out, "Holy, holy, holy." Then we have the so-called Hekhalot literature and the Merkavah literature. Together, these include a few dozen Jewish mystical texts stretching from the Second Temple period all the way through the Late Antique period. These texts focus on the creation of the universe and journeys into the heavens to reveal the structure of the divine realms. There's also late antique Jewish magical texts like the Sefer HaRazim, the Book of Secrets, which describes, among other things, how to conduct magical incantations using the names of angels. But despite this rich body of Jewish mystical texts, scholars do not consider them to be Kabbalistic texts. According to Gershom Sholem, the father of the modern academic study of Kabbalah, the first true work of Kabbalah is probably the Sefer HaBahir, which dates to the late 12th century. Scholars argue that the Bahir is the earliest Kabbalistic text because it introduces three new ideas into Jewish mysticism that almost all later Kabbalists adopted. Number one, the idea that the divine world is composed of 10 divine powers known in later texts as Sfirot. Number two, the idea that one of the divine powers is feminine, which formally introduces the idea of gender dualism into later Kabbalah. And number three, the idea that the divine powers can be described with the allegory of a tree. You've probably seen schematic drawings of this tree around the internet if you've done even a cursory study into Kabbalah. The Bahir was not created in a vacuum, though. It reworks proto-Kabbalistic ideas found in earlier books, such as the Sefer Yetzirah, which was probably composed sometime in the late antique period, we're really not sure, but by the 10th century, Jewish scholars were writing all sorts of commentaries on this book. The Sefer Yetzirah laid out the groundwork for Kabbalistic speculation about the 10 divine powers or emanations called Sfirot, as well as the mystical meaning of numbers and Hebrew letters, both topics we'll return to shortly. So the general takeaways for the origins of Kabbalah: Kabbalah emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries in southwestern Europe. Following the appearance of the Bahir, several circles of Kabbalistic teachers and mystics emerged, including around Isaac the Blind in Provence, Nachmanides in Girona, and Abraham Abulafia in the region of Castile, who was known for experiential ecstatic Kabbalah. Each and every one of these men deserved their own thoroughgoing examinations, but in general, all of them were participating in a scholarly endeavor, writing commentaries on the Torah, essays on rabbinic law, sharing prayer techniques and sermons. In other words, they were writing the same sort of genres that Jewish writers were making for centuries. It's not like there was an official division between Kabbalistic texts on one hand and non-Kabbalistic texts on the other hand. The scholar of Kabbalah, Dr. Joseph Dan, argues that these three components that I mentioned earlier are generally useful for identifying a work as being part of Kabbalah. But here I'll add the disclaimer that this is not a perfect rubric because Kabbalah is so diverse. There's almost always an exception. But let's turn to some of the most prominent ideas. First, one of the main ideas shared by almost all Kabbalists is the concept of Ein Sof, literally translated as no end or infinite. We can think of Ein Sof as an infinite impersonal God or supreme entity that we cannot describe with our own human faculties. In the words of the medieval French rabbi Isaac the Blind, Ein Sof is that which is not conceivable by thinking. To use an example from astrophysics, Ein Sof is kind of like dark matter. It's a placeholder for something that we just cannot perceive ourselves with our own senses. Ein Sof is important not just because it illustrates how mystics viewed God, but also how they viewed the universe. The great 16th century Kabbalist, Isaac Luria, developed a theory of cosmogony, or in other words, an explanation for the beginning of the universe, and he based it on Ein Sof, calling it Tzimtzum, translated as contraction. His theory of Tzimtzum goes something like this. First, in the beginning, there was only Ein Sof. Ein Sof then contracted, leaving a space in which our world developed. This means that our world only occupies a small portion of the universe. Between Ein Sof and our world, though, there are things called Sfirot, which I mentioned in the earlier discussion about the book Bahir. Now, it's impossible to define Sfirot because Kabbalists throughout time have held many different ideas about them, but some think of them as layers of existence, 10 divine powers or emanations of Ein Sof that are ordered in a hierarchy that together represent the power of the Godhead. Like I said earlier, you've probably seen depictions of the 10 Sfirot, since they're often portrayed as a tree or corresponding to different parts of the human body. Some scholars would say that the concept of Sfirot is the clearest indication of a Kabbalistic worldview. If a text mentions the Sfirot, it's a pretty safe assumption that it relies on Kabbalistic tradition, though again, there are always exceptions. We can think of the Sfirot as divine intermediaries between us and the ultimate unknowable Godhead. The one at the top is the closest to Ein Sof, and the one at the bottom, called the Shekhinah, is the one that we humans most intimately interact with, the divine power closest to the material created world. Interestingly, the Sfirot are gendered. Kabbalists conceived of the Shekhinah as feminine and often described as God's bride. Each of the Sfirot is male or female, but most have both male and female parts, and each one can be male in relation to one and female in relation to the other. This gendering of the Godhead gives us a look into another important part of Kabbalah, sexuality. The best example of this comes in the most important book in all of Kabbalah, the Zohar, or the Book of Radiance. One scholar of Kabbalah calls the Zohar the highest expression of Jewish literary imagination in the Middle Ages. It's considered by many the core text of Kabbalah, and although I call it a book, the Zohar really should be described as a body of literature. The Stanford University Press translation and commentary of the Zohar required 12 volumes to publish it. So yeah, it's not a book in the strictest sense of the word. The Zohar emerged in the 13th century from Castile, one of the major centers of Kabbalah. Most critical scholars today agree that it was composed by a rabbi named Moses de Leon. De Leon wrote it in a distinct dialect of Aramaic, mixed with Hebrew, and he framed the text as being written in the 2nd century by its main character, Shimon Bar Yochai, a real historical sage living in the 2nd century. Many Orthodox Jews today maintain that it was written by Shimon Bar Yochai himself. The Zohar is primarily a commentary on the Torah, but it reads somewhat like a mystical novel. In the book, Shimon Bar Yochai travels with his disciples around the Galilee, meeting different characters, learning and sharing mystical teachings. The Zohar develops many of the major themes of Kabbalah, including the gendering of both the Sfirot and the mystic's ultimate mission. The connection between Sfirot becomes erotic. Some are givers, some are receptors, and the mystic's ultimate mission is to initiate an erotic marriage between God and the Shekhinah. Even the search for mystical knowledge becomes sexualized in the Zohar. In one romantic passage based on the intensely erotic Song of Songs, a man passes by the house of a female lover who is a metaphor for the Torah. The man waits time and time again for the woman to reveal herself to him fully. The text says, "Hence the Torah is revealed and concealed, and lovingly goes to its lover to arouse love with him." This passage is an analogy for how some Jewish mystics view Kabbalistic practice. The Kabbalist peels back layers upon layers of understanding until the most hidden, and therefore most holy, knowledge of the scripture reveals itself. One way to describe this layered approach to the Torah is through an acronym called Pardes, which means orchard. In this acronym, each Hebrew letter stands for a different level of meaning. We won't get into what each letter stands for, but the last letter, Samek, stands for Sod, which means secret. Sod refers to the ultimate esoteric knowledge that every Kabbalist seeks. Kabbalists try to reach Sod through the text, literally. The 22 Hebrew letters, biblical passages, and Hebrew names of God are central to Kabbalah. For Kabbalists, Hebrew is a divine language, and the Torah is a living divine document. The school of the Kabbalist Abraham Abulafia believed that each letter has mystical meaning. Writing or chanting letters in specific ways brings them to life, or can help you achieve communion with the divine. Abulafia wrote, "When you begin to recite the letter Aleph, since Aleph points to the secret of unity, do not lengthen its recitation except according to the measure of one breath. And chant the Aleph and every letter you recite with terror, awe, and fear, coupled with the gladness of the soul in its comprehension, which is great." From this quotation, you can see how meditation on the letters was experiential. It was a technique involving breathing and head movements, and meditating not just on the meaning of the letters, but the sound of the letters. Even with years of study or practice and chanting like from the passage above, secret mystical knowledge is nearly impossible to gain. The prophet Ezekiel is held up as an example. In the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, often called the Merkavah vision, we see a strange description of creatures and chariots that later Kabbalists viewed as evidence that Ezekiel actually attained Sod. But testimonials of visions like this are relatively uncommon in Kabbalah. In fact, many Kabbalistic circles prohibited describing visions for fear that revealing secret knowledge could be catastrophic to the wider world. Thus, many Kabbalistic circles in the Middle Ages were made up of small groups of elite rabbis and intellectuals that were already well known in the community. A crisis in the 15th century moved the center of gravity for Kabbalistic teachings eastward. Although the Iberian Peninsula was, for a long time, a major hub for Kabbalah, it came to an end when the Spanish and Portuguese Christian monarchies expelled or forcibly converted the Jewish communities in their territories. Those who fled settled primarily in Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, leading to new centers of Kabbalah. The town of Safed in the Upper Galilee region became one of these hubs. The Rabbi Isaac Luria, also called the Ari, moved from Jerusalem to Safed in 1570 and formed a group of disciples who went on to revolutionize Kabbalistic teachings. He confronted head-on some of the biggest philosophical questions you could possibly imagine. Why does anything exist instead of nothing? Why does God exist? Why does evil exist? What is our purpose as humans here on Earth? He put forth revolutionary new theories like the one we already discussed, his creation of the universe theory called Tzimtzum, about how the universe was created by Ein Sof contracting. What was so transgressive about this theory is that he argued this process of creation actually damaged creation and introduced evil. Thus, the purpose of existence is to repair this flaw through human action, or tikkun olam, which translates as repairing the world. Luria's Kabbalah inspired several movements in the following centuries, especially a movement founded by a Ukrainian man who rocked the world of Kabbalah and all of Eastern European Judaism, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, or the Baal Shem Tov. In the early 18th century, he jump-started what is now known as the Hasidic movement, a movement that quickly spread across Eastern Europe. The Baal Shem Tov disagreed with the idea that mysticism should be reserved for the intelligentsia, and instead taught that everyone should try to commune with God. Hasidism taught that communion with God, or knowledge of the divine, was possible even for the masses during ordinary everyday life, especially through prayer. Another core change that Hasidism makes to traditional Kabbalah is the notion of divine transcendence, which teaches that God is wholly outside our universe. Hasidism, by contrast, professes that God has an immanent quality, meaning that God is present in our world and that we can climb toward communion through our everyday life, through everyday actions. Hasidism is still thriving today and exemplifies modern Jewish mysticism in practice. Now, I should be clear, Hasidism is not synonymous with Kabbalah. It does include mystical practices and beliefs, but it's much more than that. In fact, if you read the Holocaust testimonial, Night, by Elie Wiesel, you can clearly see a distinction. In the book, Elie describes how he grew up in a Romanian Hasidic community, but throughout the book he mentions that Kabbalah is a supplement to usual religious study of the Torah and the Talmud. Today, scholars generally categorize Hasidism under the broader category of Haredi Jews, often called ultra-Orthodox Jews, but the two are not synonymous. Okay, now that we've covered all of that background, what's the deal with Madonna? And here we turn to what I'm going to call pop Kabbalah, but it's worth mentioning that stricter adherents would not even call this Kabbalah in the first place. Throughout the 20th century, Kabbalah hit the mainstream in pop culture. One big neo-Kabbalistic movement is the Kabbalah Center in the United States, whose members included celebrities like Madonna, Britney Spears, Ariana Grande, and Ashton Kutcher. Started by Philip Berg and his wife Karen Berg in 1984, the center sought to popularize and spread Kabbalistic teachings, even outside of Judaism. Madonna became one of their most famous adherents, and that's why we get her James Bond music video. During the video, she is being tortured in a North Korean bunker of some sort, which is featured in the film itself. She is depicted wrapping her arm with tefillin, and at the end, the Hebrew letters Lamed Aleph Vav are burned onto the electric chair where they were just trying to kill Madonna. These letters are from one of the 72 names of God according to Jewish tradition, a tradition that became especially popular among medieval Kabbalists, and are mentioned in the Bahir and used in Kabbalistic magical practice. Though her performance sparked controversy, in part because most within the Orthodox Jewish community viewed a non-Jewish woman wearing tefillin as sacrilegious, or at least viewed it unfavorably. Other movements of modern Jewish mysticism have also sprung up in the past century and a half. The Neo-Hasidic movement and other revival movements have sought to reimagine mystical doctrine for a modern era. Some have even likened mystical experiences to the effects of psychedelic drugs. The Jewish scholar and leader of Neo-Hasidism, Arthur Green, shared one of his psychedelic experiences in one of his books. As one who tried psychedelics after some years of studying the Kabbalistic and Hasidic masters, I found that the drug-induced experiences confirmed a great deal of what I found in their writings, though he warns that such a path should never replace traditional mystical practices from throughout Kabbalah's history. Overall, one thing that Kabbalah teaches is a different way to use the mind. Kabbalah breaks its students out of a strictly logical way of thinking and pushes them to uncover new modes of contemplation. It's a powerful tradition that has survived for many centuries in esoteric circles, but shows no indication of slowing down here in the 21st century. For those of you who would like to learn more, I'm including a bibliography in the description below, and you could also check out today's sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. The Great Courses Plus is a subscription video learning service with lectures and courses taught by actual experts. And when it comes to content about religion in general and Judaism in particular, The Great Courses Plus has a very impressive lineup, including a 24-episode long series on Jewish intellectual history. This one is taught by the Ivy Ivy League historian, Dr. David Ruderman. The Great Courses Plus also has a general overview of Judaism with the scholar Isaiah Gaffney, as well as an Archaeology of the Holy Land series taught by the archaeologist Jody Magnus. I've met her personally. Her books were assigned in my graduate level courses during my PhD, so I can say that these series draw on peer-reviewed scholarship. All of them are taught by top-tier scholars in their respective disciplines, but no tests, no homework. You can watch as many different lectures as you want, anytime, anywhere. The Great Courses Plus is offering Religion for Breakfast viewers a free trial. Just go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/religionforbreakfast. Through your subscription, you gain access to their huge library of video lectures that you can stream from any device. Click on the link in the description below to start your free trial today. Thanks, everyone.